I
So,
know. Awesome. Thank you.
okay, you can go ahead.
Thank you, Jacob. Good evening,
Oh,
everyone. Welcome to February's virtual series, speaker series presentation, The History of Ottawa's Caribbean Community with guest speaker Dave Tulloch. My name is Sarazat Khan, and I am the regular events director for the Historical Society of Ottawa. I and Jacob Saloon will be your hosts tonight. Before we begin, let's take a moment to acknowledge whose land it is that we meet on tonight. For thousands of years before colonial times, the members of Indigenous communities traveled from far and wide to gather at the meeting place of the three rivers, the Ottawa, the Gatineau, and the Rideau, from the Chaudière Falls to the mouth of the Gatineau River. This area is rich in natural resources, plants, animals, and fish, and it also provided a convenient meeting place for trade and communication among communities. Of special significance are the burial place at Hull Landing and the Chaudière Falls, a sacred place for meeting and sharing in ceremonies. The burial grounds in the Ottawa-Gatineau corridor, including Hull Landing, were important for rituals of respect and bonding with the landscape. Victoria Island, located under the Portage Bridge, continues to provide this sacred space to local and visiting Indigenous people. The National Capital Region, which includes the city of Ottawa, remains unceded Algonquin Anishinaabe territory. We encourage our members and guests to reflect on this, our connected history, and ways we can contribute to reconciliation. Next, we would like to extend our thanks to the City of Ottawa, the Province of Ontario, and last but never least, to our membership. Without your support, none of what the Historical Society of Ottawa does would be possible. In fact, if you would like to become a member of the Historical Society of Ottawa, I will be putting the link to do so in the chat box. We welcome people to become members of the HSO to support our activities, such as today's speaker event, our in-person series, Awards for Students, and our Bytown pamphlet series. The Historical Society of Ottawa has been telling Ottawa's great stories for 126 years, including now through our twice monthly speaker series. As you know, we currently run two separate parallel speaker series. In-person presentations are held in the Ottawa Public Library auditorium. In addition, we bring our virtual presentations into the comfort of your home via Zoom, as we are tonight. On February 24th, we will convene at the Ottawa Public Library auditorium at 1 p.m. for a double feature when Dave Tremner and Emma Kent will give a back-to-back presentation on the history of the Boy Scouts and the Girl Guides in the nation's capital. Then on March 23rd, also at 1 p.m. at the Ottawa Public Library, James Powell will tell us about Ottawa's Women on Ice. Which brings us to tonight's presentation. Before I introduce Dave, a reminder to everyone to kindly keep your settings on mute so as not to interfere with the speaker's presentation, and turning off your video feed once we get going. This assists with our overall transmission as well. Tonight's presentation will be followed by a Q&A session. So during the presentation, please start typing your great questions into the chat box. Now it is my honor to introduce author Dave Tulloch. Dave was born in Jamaica and he immigrated to Canada in 1970 to pursue a higher education, receiving a diploma in electronics engineering at Algonquin College, a Bachelor of Administration, and a Bachelor of Commerce honors from the University of Ottawa, and a Master of Business Administration from Concordia University. He proceeded to gain extensive experience in information technology, his career including roles as a computer engineer and information systems consultant, and he has taught courses on information systems and business in CEGEP at Hull and tutored at Wake Tech College in North Carolina. Dave has written for the Ottawa Spectrum, which was a publication that focused on visible minorities in Ottawa in the 1980s and 1990s. He currently contributes to an online publication at blackottawascene.com, which highlights high achievers in Ottawa's Black community. Dave also volunteers as a musician at Ottawa Life Center Church and as a camera operator and with youth groups such as The Code, a mentoring organization that focuses on the children aged 13 to 23 of single mothers. Finally, Dave has written a book called Ottawa's Caribbean Community, History and Profile since 1955, which documents the Black history in Canada and the experience of Caribbean immigrants in Ottawa. It is available at the Ottawa Library, major booksellers in Canada, and on Amazon and petrobooks.ca. Over to you, Dave.
Thank you very much, Cher. First and foremost, I should say thanks to the Historical Society of Ottawa for inviting me to make this presentation. And I also want to call out Jacob, our tech guru, who is behind the scenes helping to make this work for me this evening. And then I'd like to thank the people that are in virtual presence here who came here to listen to this, to watch this presentation. Thank you for taking the time out. Thank you for your interest, and thank you for your support. And without further ado, I'll move into the meat of what the matter is all about this evening, and flip the next slide. Okay, so the agenda, what I'll be dealing with this evening are the following topics. I'll do a quick review of the historical timeline for Black people to settle here in Ottawa. You might find that an interesting few minutes going over that era. And then I'll turn my attention to the Ottawa's Caribbean immigrants. That is the focus of the book. I'm looking at why they came here. Why did they leave the Caribbean to come to Ottawa, a cold place like this? And then I'll try to figure out from the discussions with them how they adapted to their new homeland, and what kind of objectives they had when they came here. What were they trying to accomplish? And then we'll see how they dealt with any kind of obstacles that they encountered in trying to reach their goals. And then I'll segue. It's historic, but what we're doing here today is also historic. History is what happens each day. And so I'll look at some of the current community trends, what is happening with the same community as we sit here this evening. What does it look like? You know, looking back in time and what it was then, what does it look like today? And where do I think it's heading based on, you know, what we've learned so far? And then I'll pull out a few people that I will just highlight some of their achievements that should indicate some of the things that the Ottawa's community from the Caribbean has been doing to, you know, facilitate not just the growth in their own lives, but to help to build a better Canadian society. And I'll summarize for you. Okay, so I go to the next slide. I'm going to start with the beginnings of this area of Ottawa. You know, I believe that it's extremely important for all of us to learn about our past. You know, Marcus Garvey, who said this, people without knowledge of their past history, origin, and culture are like a tree without roots. And I certainly believe that. So let us look at how Ottawa came about in the first place, the beginnings of Ottawa. There was a gentleman by the name of Philemon Wright. Most of you know about Philemon Wright, who founded the Ottawa-Gatineau area, who planted the first settlement in this area in 1800s. And that was by the Chaudière Falls. And the place was called Wrightsville. And the next thing we knew that it was called Hull. And I guess today it's the Gatineau area. But just across the river from where I am, that place was the founding settlement from my understanding of history. So who is this gentleman, this Philemon Wright gentleman? What do we know about him? Next, if I go to the next slide, we get some detail on that. What we found from historic records is that 5 families arrived here from Woburn, Massachusetts, to settle in this area, and he led the group. There were 5 families. It was Philemon, his brother, Thomas, and his 2 sisters, Marjorie and Lavina, and they all brought their families with them. And the 5th family, what we know of that family is the name of the male leader of that family was London Oxford. And as you see from this chart, there's not much else that is known about London Oxford. They also brought with them a bunch of workmen to cut down the trees. And so there was about, I think, 66 people in this original group of settlers for this area. If I flip to the next slide, we found out from the historic records that this 5th family was a family of 4 black, actually 3 black people, London, his wife, and they had 2 children, but apparently one of them was born right here in the Ottawa area. And so we know that there was a black family as part of the original group of settlers in this region. I found that to be fascinating. You know about Colonel By, and most of us do. Bytown is the original name of Ottawa. That was founded in 1826. So this is some 26 years after the original settlers showed up here, that Colonel John By came to, incorporate the city of Bytown. And it was about 36 years after the first settlers that we have records of the second family of blacks that showed up in Ottawa, led by a gentleman by the name of Robert Richardson. Apparently they were in Nepean. Rolling forward until 1844, a third black family showed up in Ottawa, led by Perry Adams. And then later on, in around 1885, the 4th one that we have on record is a gentleman by the name of Paul Barber and his family. And it was not until 1952 when the first black from the Caribbean, because these 4 that I've mentioned before came from the US, showed up here in Ottawa. So if I go to the next slide, I'll give you some little bit more detail on these guys. We talked about London Oxford as the first person who showed up here. He was part of the Wrights pioneering group, and he's down on record as the first black settler in Ottawa Valley. He was a free Negro, and he was married in Woburn. We know he had a child who was born in Hull. And we don't know much more about him. And then in 1836, I mentioned before, Robert Richardson, he came from Connecticut, and apparently he set up shop or set up his dwelling somewhere in Nepean area. His wife, and he had 6 children with him. And from what I can gather, there are descendants of this family still around this area. I can't pinpoint any, but that's my understanding from some of the literature that I read. And then we go to 1844, Perry Adams. Adams and his wife lived here in Bytown. There's not much known about him either. We know that they had a child that was baptized at Notre Dame Cathedral down in Sussex Drive. So we can't say that much more about him. But we know a little bit more about Paul Barber. Paul Barber came from Kentucky. He was enslaved to a horse training family, and he learned to train horses. And they used to have horse races done at what we now know as TD Place. And the people in Ottawa who were, racing the horses would buy horses from this family back in Kentucky, and they'd come here every once in a while to sell their horses, and Paul Barber would come with them. And so he returned to Ottawa when he was freed and decided to make this his home. And then he became a trainer for the horse racing people here. And apparently he was pretty good at his job. Now he's got a legacy in Ottawa, by the way. If you go downtown, there's a street, Rue Barber, that was named after him. He is Black person number 5, as far as we can tell, that number 4, sorry, that came to Ottawa. Now, if we go to the next slide, we'll see a gentleman by the name of Herbert Brown. Herbert Brown came from Jamaica. He first settled in Montreal. Actually, he was on a boat, one of those, what do you call them? Anyway, he was on a ship when the war broke out, and he decided to join the Canadian forces. He went to World War II. Actually, it says World War I, but it's II. And then he returned to Montreal after the war. And he learned the dry cleaning business there. And then he moved to Hull in 1952. His family was back in Jamaica, and he got them to immigrate to Canada, and the family reunited here in Ottawa, in Hull. And then they quickly moved over to the Ottawa side. And then he opened his first dry cleaning. First, he worked at Eddie Plant, and then he opened up his first dry cleaning down on Murray Street in 1957. And he started to expand his business. And now when I came to Ottawa in 1970, he had one of his stores in Bank Street. And some of the folks who were around that time, if you were walking down in Bank Street and you walked past this place and you looked like you were a Black person, he'd call you in. And he had some kind of a book that he wanted you to sign. I never could find, after speaking with his relatives, his offspring, where that book is, but definitely he's got a record of a lot of the Black folks he had anyway, who came to Ottawa in the earlier days. But he sold his business in 1978, and if you go around Ottawa, you will see a whole bunch of Brown cleaners all over the place, and that is his legacy to the city of Ottawa. I'm going to go to the next slide and talk a little bit more. I'm kind of boring you with all of this historic backdrop, but you'll see the relevance of that. I wanted to look at the demographic of the Ottawa Black population, and I'm talking about the Caribbean peoples. And the reason why I keep saying Black, because over 90% of the Caribbean folks are Black. There are other nationalities. They are Caucasian is a small percentage, but it's almost like when you talk Caribbean, you assume it's a Black person you're dealing with. All the way from 1951 census to 2000 to 1991, you won't see any Black residents registered on Statistics Canada census record in Ottawa. That doesn't mean that they weren't here, but it was not until I think 1996 before they started to segment out the visible minority group and identify those who were Black. So you'll see in the year 2001, that census had 34,000 Blacks living here in Ottawa. And that number in the 2021 census went up to 85,000. Okay, so if I'm just going to summarize a couple of pages and then go into the meat of what we're here to discuss. If you flip to the next slide for me, Jacob. I gave you the reason for the omission, but there were some estimation of the number of Blacks, not just in Ottawa, but the Black population in Canada in those previous years. Up until 2001, the numbers were like 662. It's over a million now. It's around a million. And the last historical note on the next slide that I'll give you is looking at the actual Ottawa Gatineau area population as it is today. Residents in Ottawa in 2023, we've got about 1.4 million in the Ottawa Gatineau area. Ottawa itself, as you know, 2021 burst over a million, and the Black population in Ottawa is now about 7.8% at 114,000. So that kind of summarized the background of where we have been, where we've come, and where we are today. And I'd like to segue now to talk to you about the Caribbean community in specific. All right, the title of the book, as you've heard before, is the Ottawa's Caribbean Community History and Profile since 1955. Without going into a lot of the motivation for this, I'll just tell you what I did to put together the information that you will read if you get a copy of this book. My objective was to learn about the early Caribbean immigrants who arrived here beginning in 1950s. And there's a significant reason for the 1950s, which again, I won't go into much detail given the time constraints. But Caribbean immigrants who built up Ottawa was really, the Ottawa Caribbean community was really my target. You know, those, as well as those who did well for themselves, who achieved success in whatever fields of endeavors they chose to pursue. So those were basically my two segments of the population that I was going to look at. And if I go to the next slide, I'll tell you how I went about it. I conducted in-person interviews with the people that I could identify. Those who people would consider to be community builders, those people who volunteer their services to help others integrate into the community, help with setting up certain structures that I'll discuss a little bit about, and as well as those people who you could see based on their either economic status or some social status that done pretty good based on, you know, the time that they were here. And I tried to gather information on some of those same type of folks who had passed on, who I could not, of course, directly interview, or I couldn't find anybody who knew them well to speak with, but they had built up some kind of a footprint of information, and with the tools that we have at our disposal, that wasn't too difficult to gather secondary information on some of these folks. So that was the source of information that I used to try to compile the volume that is out there in the marketplace today. If I go to the next slide, I'll tell you what I found. We identified three primary groups of people from the Caribbean who immigrated to Ottawa in that period of time. The first group was the domestic workers. And they came here under a program called the West Indies Domestic Scheme. I'll talk a little bit more about that. And then there were students. Students trickled in from the early 50s. Most of the earlier ones were students who had means, who had economic means that they could pay their way through school. And most of the students who came here to do, they had completed their high school, and a good chunk of them had completed at least an undergrad degree and wanted to pursue something more advanced. And then there are professionals. Rolling forward to 1967, the Canadian government introduced a professional class of immigrants. If you had a job, if you were educated, if you had you know, the right type of skills that they were looking for, you could apply for landed immigrant status, and they'll grade you with a number of points based on the skill set and your education levels. And so beginning in 1967, other immigrants from the Caribbean fell into that category, and they would come to Canada under the point system that they called it at the time. I think it still exists today. So I'm going to just flip the next slide and talk a little bit more about each one of these groups. The domestic workers, why were they here? Well, after the war, everybody were building houses, doing all kinds of things, getting back into the workforce, and the families that were the Canadian families, mothers were starting to enter the workforce in droves, but they had children at home. And they had a little bit of a problem with that setup because they didn't have a way to have daycare and all of those things that their children need while they were at work. So initially, they started to source nannies from the UK, from Europe, to come and take care of their kids while they were at work. But they found out pretty quickly that that approach didn't work too well, because once the British young ladies showed up here in Canada, within a short period of time, they'd meet someone and they'd get married, and they'd be out of the job, they'd be off. So they had to solve that problem. And I think the Canadian government came up with a kind of a novel solution for it. They'd go to the Caribbean, and they had a government-to-government arrangement where they'd source domestic help from the Caribbean ladies, young ladies, had to be, I think it was 24 at the starting age, up to another, I can't recall. And they would bring them here to Canada, but the rules were stringent now. They couldn't get married, they couldn't have kids, and they had to sign a contract, 1 or 2 years, I can't recall exactly which one, I've seen both. But they had to sign a contract to provide in-house services to the families for a period of time. But there were some good incentives. At the end of that, they could extract themselves from that service and apply for landed immigrant status. And so a lot of these young ladies who came initially from Barbados and Jamaica saw this as a good way to make progress in their own lives. And then the students who came here, as I indicated before, were really looking for higher education. And most of them thought that, we'll come to Canada, we'll get an advanced degree or whatever, and then we'll head back home and we will get advancement in our jobs when we get back. That was their motivation. The professionals that I just spoke about who came here, they were already, they came here under the point system as landed immigrants. So they didn't have to worry about, going through that process. And they were just looking for better opportunities for self-improvement, self-advancement. And the fact of the matter is, all through the whole theme of self-improvement has been a common thread for all of these groups. If I go to the next slide, the immigrants from the Caribbean who came here, starting in the mid-50s, as I said, every one of them, just about all the ones that I spoke with, they came here to look for a better life. All right, just about all of the people that I spoke with intended to improve their lives beyond what they envisioned if they would have remained in their homeland. And so the term "to better myself" was repeated by many of the people that I interviewed. I'm going to move to the next slide. And each one of these Caribbean immigrant groups had a path to becoming a Canadian citizen. The domestic workers, once they gained landed status after the fulfillment of their initial contract, they could look forward to, as a number of years ensued, to become a citizen. Students could also transition from student visas to landed immigrant status if they were able to gain employment here in Canada. And in the early days, that was not too difficult. And once you were a landed immigrant, you had the opportunity to sponsor family members from your homeland, and then later on to gain citizen status, I think after 3 years. And as I said to you before, the professionals were already qualified, so they could gain their citizenship, once a 3-year period had ensued. All right, so let me just look at the objective that they came here for and see what happened there. Next slide, please. This objective of self-improvement is a pretty burning desire. It was in a lot of the hearts of the people from the Caribbean who came here. And becoming a landed immigrant was one of the critical milestones to get to that objective. So everyone, domestic workers, everyone who came here had that in mind. because once they had a landed immigrant status, they had the capability, as I said, to sponsor their family members to join them here in Canada and to support them. Having a family around, facilitating your own personal growth and the development of their own family members was a key criteria in their thinking. And so they set off to do that, to sponsor. Once they got their landed immigrant status, they began to sponsor those that were back home, their siblings and their parents in some cases, to join them here in Canada. But in all cases, starting even with domestic workers, they found ways to up their educational status. Some who had by the way, I should say that a lot of the people who came here as domestic helpers were professionals in their home country. They were nurses, they were teachers, they were administrators. Yeah, and you still had those who just didn't have that much education, but they had to pass certain courses to ensure that they could do the job when they got here. But once they got here, a lot of them enrolled in adult education classes and start to upgrade their academic acumen. And it's surprising how some of these, you will see a couple of examples later on, where a number of these folks made phenomenal progress in their own personal development and in their community development, and even in this country's development. Okay, so education and job opportunities were at the top of their list. And ultimately, as I said before, becoming a Canadian citizen and having the full rights and privileges of all Canadians was definitely part of the plans that they had in mind. So I'm going to just go to the next slide and talk about this a little bit more in their self-improvement. So I told you that many of these folks were professionals in the sense at their home country. And once they had gone through the specific training for admission to the domestic program, when they arrived here, they took advantage of as much education opportunities as they could. I mentioned before that some could completed their high school, and there is one I will call out, and I will call out by name and by one of the case in point that I will talk to you about later on, who actually made it to the higher level in the Canadian government. I'm sure there are others, but this one stands out pretty good. So let's go to the next slide. And this lady that I'm talking about, who made it to the Canadian government higher echelons, her name is Jean Augustin, Dr. Jean Augustin. You may recall she was the parliamentary secretary of state, or secretary for Jean Chrétien. She immigrated to Canada in 1960 under the West Indian domestic scheme. And then she went and upgraded her education level. She studied at the University of Toronto. She earned a Bachelor of Arts and a Master of Education. And then she went and became an elementary school principal and at the Metropolitan Separate School Board in Toronto. And ultimately, she was the first Black Canadian woman to serve as a federal minister of the Crown and a member of Parliament. So here is a story of a person who came to Canada as part of the domestic scheme. And she's still out there doing a lot of community work today. But this is one of the success stories that I mentioned earlier on. Let me go to the next slide. I look at the student immigrants. And I mentioned earlier on, I won't repeat too much, they came here primarily to get a higher education and with the objective of going home. But as it turned out, the majority of them remained here in Canada for a lot of different reasons. And even some that went back to their homeland came back to live and to work here in Canada. Okay, and so an overwhelming number of these folks made significant contributions to Canada in a variety of disciplines. I'll just pull one out on the next slide to indicate what I'm talking about. And this gentleman, Dr. Rudy Gittins, He was born in Trinidad. He arrived here in 1953 as a student. He attended the University of Saskatchewan. He obtained a pharmaceutical and medical degrees from the University of Saskatchewan and a fellowship in orthopedics at the University of Ottawa. He was a team doctor for the Ottawa Rough Riders football team for more than 20 years. And then he took on the same role for the Canadian national soccer team in 1984. And he was inducted in Canadian Soccer Hall of Fame in 2007 and the CONCACAF Hall of Fame in 2007 as well. There's a lot more about Rudy Gittins that I couldn't put on the slide, and there are a lot of other guys that I could talk about in the same vein. Again, given the time constraints, if you go through the book, you will see a few that has made, phenomenal contribution to not just to Ottawa, but to Canada as a whole. So that's from the student population. I'm going to move a little bit onto the professional group now. One example on that. So those who came to Canada as under the point system as professionals, they could immediately find employment. There was no issue there. Okay, because many of these were targeted in areas that they were low labor. The labor resources was not well fulfilled, so they came and they could find jobs pretty easy. And in general, most of these folks made extremely good progress with their objectives. And in many cases, if you look at how their children fared, not just in this group, but in the others as well, their children are faring much better than they did. And so if I go to the next slide, I'll get a point, an example for you. There is this gentleman called Gil Scott. He arrived in Canada in 1968. He was a meteorological technician in Jamaica. And he obtained employment when he came here as a meteorological service in the Canadian Meteorological Services. And after becoming, he got himself really deep into the community structural building that I'm talking about earlier on. Those guys who spent their time doing things to help the community, to help others integrate into the Canadian environment. He was one of those guys, and he became the first president of the Jamaican Ottawa Association, Community Association, at his inception. And this changed his career direction. He ended up with a job in the federal government, several different jobs over time. And his final job before his retirement was he was the Public Service Commissioner between 1988 and 1994. Another success story that I'm pointing out to you. Now, none of this came so easily for these guys. For many other immigrants, the journey towards self-improvement was not a smooth one. You just didn't get there. And when I spoke with them, a lot of the immigrants told me about all kinds of obstacles that they had to overcome. The most troubling one, though, was that some of the opportunities that they tried to get at, it's not in my notes, but I'm gonna call this one out because it makes it live what I'm saying. Their race was the common denominator in either not getting an opportunity or in preventing them from doing something that they figured that, the normal person. Here is one gentleman that is written, I've written this, so it's out there in the public. He was a Canadian athlete on 76 Olympic, and he was a lawyer. And he went in for an interview for a job, and he spent about 3 hours, he said, in the lobby, waiting for the interviewer to call him in, and that never happened. And he told me that every once in a while somebody would stick their head out of their office and look if he was still there. Today, he's the guy who runs Hockey Canada. So, this is real stuff we're talking about. Won't spend much more time on it, but some of the obstacles that these folks came across, in all of them, in just about every case, were able to circumvent or to minimize their impact on how they saw themselves making progress in some ways or the other. Okay, so I'm going to just shift focus now to some of the structures that these guys built. When the folks who came here in the early 50s, came to Ottawa, most of these guys, most of these people didn't know anybody in the city. And they started to recognize that there were other compatriots, and they would gather together. The domestic folks would gather at the YMCA on their days off, and just had camaraderie. And then sooner or later, once they started to get out of their contract and started to try to forge things on their own, they realized that they needed support, and they started to lean on each other. And as the numbers grew, they found that it was important for them to gather as a community, and it started to look like island-specific communities. Those folks from Jamaica would gather together. The folks from Barbados would gather together, the folks from Trinidad, and these community structures start to build up community associations. Each one of the island communities, and they're still there today, has an association of the people from that specific Caribbean island, which they gather together to share things that are native, things that they can, relate to, and they also have a pretty tight liaison with their consulates or high commission. And what they do is they set up these structures to help people who are immigrants, new immigrants, to integrate and to assimilate quickly, much more so than if they were on their own. So they serve a pretty decent focus. And of late, next slide, please. Of late, there is, I talk about the island specific. Here is a copy of a website front page for the Trinidad Association that I just mentioned. I can flip the slide into the other end. One area that next slide for me, Jacob. One area that I didn't mention is that students at the different universities, and I found out that this is all over Canada, have their own student association, and it's all, again, relevant to the islands that they're from. There is an Ottawa U, there's Carleton, I'm pretty sure there's one at Algonquin. And if you look, most of the universities across Canada, there would be some kind of a base student organization on their campus. Let me flip to the next slide. But there is also an umbrella organization that tries to group these folks together, at least representatives of these groups, especially in an area where they're looking for some kind of a cross structural reliance, where there are some way to liaise between each one of these island groups. So there are some of these umbrella organizations that pulls people from different community groups together from time to time. And this is one of them. Okay, so let me just go and look forward to where we're going with all of this. I just told you about the beginnings, how things kind of evolved over time. And looking forward, we recognize now that it's been about 70 years or somewhere there that these folks have been here in Ottawa. And what is happening? We can recognize, even by myself talking to some of these folks, that their children are doing great compared to where they were. And they're faring much better than their parents in most cases. And I'm going to call out 3 examples. We've got a Deputy Minister of Justice and the Attorney General, who is the daughter of a domestic immigrant. We've got the current Deputy Minister of the Communication Security Establishment is a daughter of student immigrants from the Caribbean, from Haiti. And we've got the current Canadian ambassador to the World Trade Organization, who is the daughter of student immigrants from St. Lucia who came to Ottawa. If I flip on the next slide to just drill down a little bit on these folks. Shalene Curtis McAuliffe. She earned her Bachelor of Laws at, she went to school here in Ottawa. Her mom and her aunt and family members are living right here in Ottawa. She went to high school in Ottawa. She went to did her law degree down in Toronto, and she did an undergraduate in University of Ottawa, and that is the person that I just mentioned, who is the deputy minister, recently appointed about a year or so ago for the Attorney General of Canada and the Ministry of Justice. So, this is a case in point of a child of an early immigrant that is just done extremely well career-wise and become part of the Canadian establishment. If I just slip to the next slide, similar case here, Caroline Xavier, who is a deputy minister. She did her bachelor's of administration at the University of Ottawa. She did a master electronic commerce in Dalhousie, and she's the chief of a communication security establishment, and like I said, a daughter of Haitian immigrants who actually came to Montreal at the start. Next slide, please. And the last one I'll talk about is the ambassador, Nadia Theodore. Her parents came to Ottawa to do advanced education, to do advanced degrees. She was born here in Ottawa. She's got 2 siblings, and she's out in Europe, Brussels, I think, where she is managing the Canadian chapter of the World Trade Organization for the government of Canada there. Again, she's a daughter of Caribbean immigrant parents who are students here in Ottawa. Okay. Let me just summarize things for you, and then I'll probably jump in, try to see if I can answer some of your questions. I think we're good with time. So those that I've profiled, the Caribbean immigrants that I've profiled, they set out to improve their lives, the lives of their families. And all of the groups that I have identified for you, in all of those groups, we see that their objectives were met. I'm not saying that 100% of the people met their objectives, but generally speaking, it seems that most of them did. I called out Jean Augustin as one of the case in point, where someone came here as a domestic and became a minister. All right. And in the student and professional categories, most of them remain here in Canada, including myself. And this is what we have did what we could to contribute, not to our family, not just to our families, but to this country. And the key to all of this, as you notice in my deliberation, was the fact that getting an education, knowledge, was the centerpiece of most of what these folks considered to be the catalyst for them to get ahead. So that will take us to our question and answer session. Thank you for listening. Hope I didn't bore you too much. So I'm going to turn it over to Cheryl, see if she has any questions that she want to throw at me.
Thank you so much, Dave. That was a fantastic presentation. I have a few questions, but I'm also going to look in the chat box and ask Dave your questions. So please feel free to put them in the chat. To start us off, during your research, what surprised you the most about the experiences of Caribbean immigrants in Ottawa?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. As I said before, as I spoke to a few of these people that I spoke with who arrived in the early days, a few of them kind of stood out in my mind. The first one is from the Browns family. I spoke with one of the daughters who joined her father, who came from Jamaica. She came here, I think, was 1954 or something, 53. And she was giving me a story about what Ottawa was like then. Don't know if most people know this, but Ottawa had streetcars in those days.
Yeah.
And she was telling me about the streetcars that was running down Rideau Street which by the time I got here in 1970, none of that existed. But that was the public transit system in Ottawa all the way up until I think 1959. So that I found pretty fascinating. You asked me one of the experience. What that was one of my surprises.
Yeah.
The other one was that the most of these folks that I spoke with, and including even myself, even up to 1970, when you walk down a street in Ottawa and you saw a Black person on the other side of the road, your face would light up, and and for both sides, and you'd meet in the middle of the road if it was necessary to introduce yourself to each other. I mean, that doesn't happen today, but the situation at that time. So yeah, the historic references of how things were is always a fascinating thing for me.
Yeah, that is really fascinating. And moving on to historical experiences, in your book, you reference looking for sources on Black history in Canada for your daughter's school project in an Ottawa library and not finding any. In many ways, your book is your contribution towards rectifying that. From your perspective, what are the ramifications of not being able to find your history in a library or archive?
Sorry, I think that's huge. People today are even going online to see where they came from, try to track down their own personal family tree. So I believe there's an innate desire for us to understand our past. And so it's important, I believe, that there is some reference point that you can go to, some reference to say, hey, how did this happen? Why am I here? How did I get here? And I look at that. I've got grandkids, and I'm hoping that they've got a reference, which my kids didn't have. So that is really at the core of it. I think we all have that drive, that motivation to understand, our past, and so the ramifications is significant. Not just the person themselves, but those around us. All of us. We can learn about each other if there are information that gives us some historic reference, and we better off as a community, as a country, when we know much more about each other than if we didn't.
Exactly. It reminds me of that quote you gave: if you don't know your history, you're like a tree without roots.
Yeah.
Final question from me. Being part of a diaspora can be challenging. How did your interviewees, first and second generation, navigate building community in Canada, honoring their cultures, and navigating what being both from the Caribbean and Canadian meant to them? Were there differences between first generation immigrants and their children?
Okay. Yeah. So the focus of the book was on the first generation immigrants, as you know, right? And many of them spoke about their children when they were talking to me, and it was really, really an elevating experience for me when I heard what some of the children were doing. So there is a big difference between the people who came and tried to struggle to make ends meet and their children and their children's children, as a matter of fact. Because like I said, some of these folks, one of the oldest of these immigrant group is a 95-year-old lady that I know of. One of the ones that I interviewed up front was 95 when I interviewed her. She's no longer here. So a lot of these folks have great grandchildren in some cases, and all of just the same thread runs through. I think the same motivation that they brought with them, they tried to, to transmit that to their children, and it goes from one generation to the other, and everybody tries to improve on their own personal lives. So if you look at the original immigrant, that first generation and the second generation immigrants, their children are doing a lot better in every measure. Well, you see the three examples that I gave in every measure than their parents did. And Canada is a better place for it, for that kind of thing. You know, there's no question about it. Okay, so mostly the other point about the second generation, third generation is that the first generation grappled with this dual loyalty. You know, am I Jamaican or am I Canadian? Even though, you know, and people ask them, where are you from, kind of thing all the
Yeah.
time. And they still do that with the next generation, but the
Mhm.
next generation consider themselves Canadian just like anybody else, and maybe even get a little bit irritated when somebody asks them, where are you from? Because they don't see, in fact, some of these folks have never even been to the Caribbean. So they don't have an identity crisis with trying to figure out who they are. They see themselves as Canadian, and that is the way it is. And that's very good. You know, there is no issues there for them. They move along with their life. Not to say that they don't have issues or challenges, but 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 they see themselves as Canadian.
Mhm. That's fascinating. Turning to the audience, Ben Weiss says, wonderful presentation, Dave. I'm looking forward to reading your book. Can you elaborate on why Caribbeans immigration was delayed until the 1950s?
Yeah, that's a touchy subject. You know that. Well, the immigration laws in Canada, the immigration policies were pretty restrictive,
Mhm.
you know, especially when it came to blacks. You know, in fact, there is a lot of political movement to ensure that blacks don't immigrate to Canada. In about 1952, that eased up a bit. And by 1962, it was pretty clear that the racial barriers was completely eliminated. And that is really the source of it. Until 1952, you weren't, if you were black, you probably could not immigrate to Canada.
Mhm. So there was a shift in Canada's immigration policy
Yes,
that led
yes.
to more
Yeah, that changed,
immigrants.
that started to change in 1952, but full changes came about 10 years later.
Mhm. That's really interesting to know. I didn't really know much about the history of immigration policy, but you talk about it really nicely in your book. So that was um, fascinating to um, to learn about. Um, if any of you have any questions, you can put them in the chat. Um, you know, I really taught the history in the first part of your presentation of Black immigrants coming here very early on in our history was really fascinating, and that we know the first families that came and settled here. Um, that must have been um, fascinating to research.
That's correct.
All right. Thank you so much for a fantastic presentation, Dave.
You're most welcome.
And thank you, Jacob, for helping us with a
Thank,
PowerPoint.
thank you, Dave. It was interesting. I learned a lot.
Appreciate it.
Thank
And we're getting many comments from our audience about how much they appreciated your presentation. And thanks to you for writing this book and telling the story of Caribbean immigrants. Thank you so much, everyone. I hope you have a wonderful night. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you. Have a good night.
Okay,
Bye.
wonderful.